All right. Good evening. Welcome. My name is Pat Cawiezell. I'm the buyer and author program coordinator at Magic City Books in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I want to welcome you tonight to our virtual author event with Robert Bryce, the author of A Question of Power. This book came out in March from Public Affairs, and we were all set to have Robert visit us at Magic City Books in March. We had the date, we had everything lined up, and the world changed and everything kind of shook around a little bit. And so we're really pleased that he was able to reschedule us for tonight and that we could continue to be able to have this discussion and share this book with our community of readers. It's a really fascinating look at electricity and power and kind of global markets. And we're going to dive into a lot of that tonight. And you're going to find a really fascinating subject here. We are really, excited about our virtual author program schedule that we have coming up. We started this April 20th with Mondays and Thursdays, and that first, about month or so, that's kind of how we had booked out. We're now at a stage where we're doing almost every week. We're doing 3 events, always on Mondays, always on Thursdays, and then often on either a Tuesday or a Wednesday. We have a lot of them coming up. If you're joining us tonight by Facebook Live, you're going to see some of those maybe pop up from time to time, but check out magiccitybooks.com. That's a full listing of where we are. We've got science books, we've got public policy books, we've got novels, we've got just a lot of stuff that's coming up, almost always at 7 p.m. Always hosted on Zoom, usually shared to Facebook Live at the same time. So we hope that you'll join us again. We hope that this has been something that you've enjoyed and something that can kind of get your mind off of some of the other things that are going on in the world. There are a lot of things certainly going on here locally in Tulsa, and so we're mindful of that, of course, at Magic City Books. We are going to be open tomorrow, Friday, the store downtown at the corner of Archer and Detroit. We are going to be open from 10 to 4 tomorrow. At some point, we're going to be outside during the day, passing out water, passing out material for folks about, reading lists and other things to be able to be kind of taking a look through. And so we're going to be there as part of our community in Tulsa. And then right now, the plan is to be open on Saturday as well. We will see if that changes, but right now the plan is that we'll be open Saturday during the day as well, 10 to 4, and again, to be there as a resource and support for our local community and to be there for anyone that's looking for more reading material and things to kind of keep the conversation going in their life. So that's what we have going on right now. If you aren't, subscribing to our newsletter, please do. You can do that from our homepage. magiccitybooks.com is always a good place to see what all is happening, all of our different offerings and what we have coming up down the road. So I wanted to introduce tonight's speaker. Robert Bryce is a native Tulsan and the author of a number of books. His most recent one, A Question of Power, is the first book by Robert that I have read, and I'm very excited to talk to him tonight about the book. As I told Robert earlier, I have a little bit of an interest kind of from birth of electricity. My father was an electrician for 40 years, and so I've kind of been aware of electricity in that way that you can be aware of the things that your parents are doing that are a little bit different than I think people, if my father had been an accountant, I maybe would have known numbers a little bit better than I do. But knowing this and just kind of knowing where that comes from, Robert's book talks a lot about, and we're going to get into a lot of it, but it really talks about electricity on the global scale. And I think that we're going to have a really fascinating conversation tonight. Robert is also a filmmaker and has had films debut at very prestigious film festivals throughout the country, and they're available for you to be able to watch as well, and on a number of topics. And so I'm really proud to welcome Robert Bryce for our virtual event tonight. Thank you, Robert.
I'm really thrilled to be here, Pat, and love Tulsa. Would love to be in Tulsa. I'm here. I guess this is the next best thing we can do for now. But yeah, great to be on with you in Magic City, and Thrilled to talk about the book, and cool about your dad. You know, you grow up around things like this, and I always thought being an electrician is a really honorable trade, and one that I always, you know, I like pliers, and my siblings will tell you that, pliers and screwdrivers and all the rest of it. I love that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just kind of get started on where your interest in electricity and in looking at not just, you know, the fact that when you flip the switch, the light comes on, but really talking about, you know, where that electricity comes from and where that interest came from for you that you started to work on this project.
Sure. Well, I don't want to go all the way back to the beginning, but I think, you know, being from Tulsa was one of the reasons why I was so interested in the energy business. My dad wasn't in the energy business, but he had friends who were in oil and gas and pipelines. And it was the first time I'm, you know, growing up, as you were talking about your dad, being around my dad and his friends and learning about, oh, well, they're drilling this well, or they're doing a pipeline project in Panama or Iran, or it gave me an idea of this kind of broader international sense of what the energy business is really about. And so, you know, I've been writing about the energy business now for 30 some years, but it was just a few years ago where I saw a clip in the news, and I think it was in the New York Times, about electricity shortages in Nigeria. And it prompted and jogged in my mind a story that had been on 60 Minutes many years ago, Morley Safer being in Lagos. And there was a kind of a little smirk on his face because he was in Lagos and he was looking at this warehouse full of lead acid batteries. And he's saying, well, this is their electricity backup, you know, and you know, kind of the unspoken message was, how pathetic is this, right? So in I'm guessing a 30-year, 40-year time span, nothing in Nigeria had changed. And so that made me think, well, now there's a story here. And the further I got into it, and just then traveling around the world and thinking about this and looking at it, because I'd look at the world in spreadsheets and think about numbers, this is the world's most important and fastest growing form of energy. So I thought, well, why don't I write a book on this? And I got a contract for the book. And then I thought, well, I'll just make a movie at the same time. How hard can that be? Well, it was kind of hard, but I got it done. And it was great to be able to actually shoot the film while I was writing the book.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah. So to talk a little bit about, you know, electricity, maybe it would be good to kind of give ourselves a little bit of a primer or some kind of anchoring numbers to kind of be able to talk about. One of the ones that you talk about in the book is, you know, one of the standard kind of units of electricity is basically the amount of electricity that an average American refrigerator uses.
Right.
And I think that, you know, just kind of talking about that a little bit to kind of get us anchored in what those numbers look like.
Sure. So energy units are hard, right? They're measured in a lot of different metrics, right? In the gas business, they sell it in therms, decatherms, cubic feet, million cubic feet. And just yesterday, the BP Statistical Review of World Energy came out. For years, they'd measured it in million tons of oil equivalent. That was their default number that they'd publish. Just this year, they changed it to exajoules. Well, I mean, very few people know what a ton of oil equivalent is. Even fewer know what an exajoule is.
Right.
Electricity is even harder because you think, well, watts and watt hours. Well, what's a watt? A watt is a measure of power. Watt hour is a measure of energy. Well, so I thought, okay, and other people had done this. Todd Moss at the Center for Global Development, now at the Energy for Growth Hub, a few years ago, published a piece about using his refrigerator as a metric. And so I thought, now that's clever because everybody knows their refrigerator runs all the time and it uses a certain amount of electricity. So I got a watt meter, plugged my kitchen refrigerator, my old Whirlpool into it, and it uses about 1,000 kilowatt hours per year. Well, then I looked at World Bank data and crunched that with a friend of mine, Seth Meyers, here in Austin. And we figured that there are about 3.3 billion people in the world today who live in places where electricity consumption is less than 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. And so, I mean, and maybe if, you know, we talked about this before, could I just show those quick slides?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
So I know everybody's getting used to being on Zoom now, so I'm going to, in the spirit of Zoom, show this, just a few slides. So the heart of the book for me came when I visited Majlishpur in India. It's in West Bengal. It's located about an hour southeast of Kolkata. My visit was facilitated by the woman on the right, Joyashree Roy, who's become a dear friend of mine. And we arrived in India in late 2016, right after Modi, Prime Minister Modi, had issued demonetization. There was no currency in the country. The rupee notes were, hard to find. You couldn't find, and India runs on paper money. But nevertheless, she made everything happen. She arranged our visit to this small village called Majlishpur, and there we met the woman on your left, Rahena Jamadar. And Joyashri translated from Bengali, and I started talking to her about her house. We're standing just on the porch of her home, and she was 44 years old when I met her. She had her first child when she was 16. She didn't get electricity in her home until she was 30 years old. She'd had it for 14 years. She'd lived most of her life effectively in the dark. And so as we talked, and she said she had 3 kids, and one of her daughters was in the university in Kolkata, and she was clearly proud of that. And we talked about what she used the electricity for, and grinding spices in the kitchen. They have a home entertainment system, but it was really key was lights, and something we take for granted. I've LED light here. I have lights overhead, but the lights for her were personal because it allowed her children to study at night, and it allowed her daughter to be in the university, and she was clearly proud of that. So at one point, I asked her. I said, "So Rahena, when you were growing up, and you had lights in your house at night, would you have gone to the university?" And she didn't hesitate for but a half second. She nodded her head to the right in the way that people in West Bengal tend to do. And she said, "Yes, I would have gone." And there wasn't any kind of, remorse or any despair in it or disappointment. It was just, well, of course I would have. Like I'd asked her whether the sun was going to come up in the east in the morning. And I thought about it for days after that. And I was in Jaipur a few days later, and it just came to me that darkness kills human potential, and electricity nourishes it. And this woman just humanized this whole problem, right? This under electrified world that we live in. So a little bit about Majlishpur. It's a rural, agricultural, predominantly Muslim village. So I just have 9 slides. I'll show you just this next one I lovingly call the trifurcated donut. The high watt, low watt, and unplugged worlds. The unplugged world, that's 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year or less. That's one American refrigerator. High watt world, above 4,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. We in the U.S. use about 12 or 13,000. But above 4,000 kilowatt hours per capita, the standards of living don't rise much. You don't see much improvement in terms of education levels, longevity, et cetera. The low watt world is in between, right? So these countries aren't necessarily poor, but they're not necessarily rich either. So the second part of the trifurcated donut is this graphic. There are 3.3 billion people today living in the unplugged world. And look at the distribution though, 74 countries. 4 out of 10 people in the world today live in places where electricity consumption is less than my kitchen refrigerator. And what about the religious makeup? Well, the Christians are divided pretty evenly among the 3 groups, the 3 groups, high watt, low watt, and unplugged. But the Islamic world is heavily concentrated in the unplugged world. And why does that matter? Because the Islamic population is growing faster than the Christian population. If you believe in the clash of civilizations, if you believe that we're destined for more controversy, more conflict with the Islamic world, well, look at the growth rates that are occurring in the Islamic world. This is Pew Research data. The other data, this is World Bank data, but this is all Pew Research estimates on where the world population will be in 40 years, and the Islamic population will be substantially larger. And many of these Islamic citizens are going to be living in the unplugged world. So why does that matter beyond the population breakdown? It matters to women and girls. As I point out in the film, I point out in the book, electricity frees women. Electricity liberates women and girls from the pump, the stove, and the wash tub. This is a Library of Congress photo. They have a great photo collection if you're ever looking for historical photos of women washing clothes by hand in Kentucky in 1916.
Robert, can I cut in for just 1 second? We've had a couple of requests to have you talk just a little bit louder or get the microphone
okay, sure.
closer. Just
how about that? Is that more?
I think it is. Yeah.
That more gooder. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. My mother would be proud of that. More gooder. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is the women in Kentucky in 1916, and electricity is key, and it was one of the motivations for the politicians in the United States who passed rural electrification. Sam Rayburn, George Norris, Burton Wheeler, and Lyndon Johnson was a great promoter of rural electrification. So this is 1916. This is in Majlispukur in 2016. Women pumping water by hand. And when you don't have electricity, when women and girls don't have electricity, they wash their clothes by hand, they haul water by hand, and they gather wood for the stove by hand. This is one of the key reasons why I wrote the book as well, is that if we're serious about inequality, if we're serious about women's rights, if we're serious about climate change, we have to be laser focused on electricity. So one of the points that I think is key is, well, where will we get the juice? How will we get these 3.3 billion people that are now unplugged? How will we get them plugged in? And that's one of the great challenges that we face in the 21st century. We talk about it some in my new film. Thank you for mentioning it, Pat. It's Juice, How Electricity Explains the World, came out June 2nd. It's available on all these different streaming platforms. That I'm easy to find. You can look on the Google or the interweb. Those are the Twitter handles for the film and for my own Twitter site. And then this is one of my favorite photos. It was again from Majlispukur. It's taken by my wife, Lauren, when we were there. But I just wanted to present those few slides to kind of bring home these numbers, to make people understand what, the scale of the problem or the challenge and how we might deal with it in the future. So enough of the slides. I know everybody gets plenty of PowerPoint, but I was motivated to just kind of, liven it up and make it maybe add a little color.
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you. And I think it allows us to get reconnected in. I will tell you, going through the book, you do a really nice job of continuing to kind of remind the reader, where our scales are and kind of what the numbers are meaning, and continuing to reference, things that are domestic and something that everyone can kind of wrap their head around, which is, the power that your refrigerator pulls, the power that your lights pull, the power that your computer pulls, or whatever it might be. I think that seeing those differences can be rather shocking. I mean, I think intellectually we know that there's big chunks of the world that don't have access to great power, but to see how many people are really living in the dark and to see it graphically like that, it's a powerful image.
Well, and I think, the one of the things that was key to me, and, one of the questions I've been asked is, what surprised you most? Mm-hmm. It was that the level, I thought I understood poverty. I thought I'd seen poverty. I didn't know from poverty. I mean, truly, until I got to India. But I also saw a different kind of poverty in the United States, in Puerto Rico. And that was a real eye-opening experience, going there in 2018, fully 7 months after Hurricane Maria had devastated the island. And there were still hundreds of people, if not thousands, that were without power then. And these are American citizens on American soil. And they were forced to use small gasoline generators. Well, we in the U.S., in the mainland U.S., in the states that in the places that aren't colonies, that aren't adopted but don't have states' rights, we would never dream of living like that. And yet, this family that I met, Iris Ortiz and her family, Wilfredo Roque and their kids, they had been living for 7 months just depending on a small gasoline generator that was smelly, loud, expensive. And they not only had to deal with the noise from their generator, but from the generators next to them, next door. I mean, it was a terrible way to live. And It was another 2 months before they were without grid power for 9 months. It was just incredible.
Yeah. Well, and you think about, that's the homes. I mean, what about the hospitals? What about the facilities that are supposed to be caring for the elderly or the sick, and where are they supposed to pull that power from? I've had family members that have had, very strong medical issues that needed and electricity is the very first thing that's needed to be able to run the machines to keep them alive or to keep
oxygen machines, dialysis.
That's right.
I mean, heart monitors, you name it. I was visited a friend of mine who was in the hospital for a day or two, and the wall behind his bed is nothing but electrical outlets. I mean,
Right.
15 or 20 of them. So, and that was one of the things that was interesting in Puerto Rico that I write about in the book, was that it was the Milken Institute and I think it was the Associated Press, if memory serves. They did an analysis of all the people who had died in Puerto Rico after the hurricane.
Yeah.
And the hurricane, when it struck, people got hit, they got, damage, from their house falling on, the other things that happened during the hurricane, which, I mean, the force of that hurricane was truly unbelievable. In Puerto Rico, you could look and the direction the wind had come from, because there were no leaves on those sides of the trees on that side. I mean, it stripped the bark off of them. It was a powerful hurricane. But there were hundreds of people who died in the weeks and months after the hurricane for lack of electricity.
Yes.
Now, the deaths were not attributed directly to the hurricane, but it was long-term health problems that had caused them to get worse. And then they didn't get treated, or they couldn't get their medicine, or it wasn't refrigerated. And these things ultimately caught up with dozens and hundreds of people. So, I mean, electricity is the key to modernity, and the places that have it in abundance and reliable, that's the key difference in the world today.
That's right. So we're going to get into fuel, but before we do, there are a couple of other kind of barriers to be able to provide electricity that you go into in the book, and one of them that really struck out, that has stuck with me, having read the book a couple of weeks ago, was just how secure the network can be, how secure the grid can be, and that it has to be reliable, and people have to be able to rely on being on that grid working, and there being electricity that's there. And that's a tremendous feat of engineering, that we could have the right amount of electricity available at any given time. And I think that, again, it's one of those things that maybe, your junior year physics class or a college, physics class that you took, you kind of sort of started to understand this a little bit, but it's easy to forget just how important the grid being balanced with the demand is to the success of an electrical grid.
Sure. Not only does that demand have to the production meet the demand instantaneously, constantly, right? Yeah. And that the voltage can only vary by a few tenths or hundredths of a degree, but it also has to be in tune, right, at 60 hertz. And so it's a massive undertaking. And so that's why the grid itself is such a marvelous bit of engineering, and that we have harmonized this grid across a continent size territory. And it reminds me, just apropos of nothing, but I do write about Iraq in the book. But mm-hmm. Iran and Iraq, as you recall, were at war 40 years ago, and hundreds of thousands killed. They just synchronized their grids, because the Iranians are now selling electricity to the Iraqis. And why are the Iraqis electricity short? In large part because of the bombing done in the first and second Iraq wars. I only bring that up because that idea that now these two countries that were former enemies, in fact, are synchronized on the single most important machinery in their countries. And that synchronization, that ability to keep the grid tuned, as where we started, it's absolutely key. And so if you switch on your air conditioner or the aluminum smelter down the street, that voltage and frequency has to be maintained at a very narrow tolerance, and it's extremely important that it stay within those tolerances, or we have blackouts.
Right. And that's another thing that, I remember as a kid growing up, we had often power outages. We would experience that and they'd be in daylight. I mean, it wasn't a storm related thing where something went. It would be overloading a system and kind of unpredictable a little bit. And I think I grew up in a different community. I wasn't in Tulsa, but I imagine that that's sort of the way things were everywhere a little bit. And it just doesn't seem like it seems like we have even stretched it even further, and that happens so infrequently now that we can forget how important electricity is to our daily lives, because it is so present and so available and so easy that it's hard to remember that it's it took a lot of work to get to this place.
And how incredibly reliable it is.
Yeah.
And you know, we only notice our electricity when it goes out. We only notice it when there's a blackout. And we think, wait, I can't make coffee. Oh, don't open the refrigerator. You know, oh, the air conditioner's off. Oh, how am I going to sleep tonight? It's going to sweat like crazy. But this, as you say, is the daily life for people all over the world. And we really saw this in Beirut. And I'd wanted to go to Beirut my entire life. And that was one of the highlights really of doing this book and making the film, was going to the city that used to be known as the Paris of the Mideast. Well, now it's a war-torn city still. 2 million Syrian refugees are now living in Lebanon. And it is the country is still divided along sectarian lines, the Shia, the Sunni, and the Christians. But they have 3-hour blackouts in Beirut every day. And that's in Beirut, the city that is the single most important city in the country. In areas outside of Beirut, 7, 10, 12 hours a day. So everyone in Lebanon effectively pays 2 electric bills. One to EDL, Electricité du Liban, which is the grid operator, and another to the generator mafia, the local generator in their neighborhood who is providing power when the grid goes out, and the grid goes out all the time. And those 2 bills, you could pay more to the grid, to the generator mafia than you do to the grid operator, because everybody wants reliable electricity, and they will do whatever they have to do to get it.
Yeah. And so I wanted to get into, talking a little bit about fuel and kind of where that goes. And I'd like to just start with a little bit of history, that kind of where American electricity had really developed, and as America, first the cities, and then as we did rural electrification, kind of where that fuel came from that provided the power, and kind of where that has been going as we go into the 20th or 21st century.
Sure. Well, the short answer is that the grid in the United States, Edison's grid, his microgrid, had started in Lower Manhattan, and we'd call it a microgrid now, because that's in fact what it was. But it ran on coal, and coal was the principal fuel for the electric grid in America for decades after that. And then we started to use a little bit more oil, and in fact, in 1973, about 20% of all the electricity in the U.S. was being made from oil. Then the price spike hit, and Jimmy Carter said, let's build more coal plants. So they built more coal plants. Today, coal is on its way out. It's being largely supplanted by natural gas. And, wind and solar are making, big inroads as well. But you look, in fact, the latest data, global data, shows coal globally is still about 36%, 37% of the global electricity mix. And China's recently announced they're going to build more coal-fired power plants. So, the fuel that's used in a given region, we went to Iceland as well. In Iceland, they use hydropower for 75% of the electricity, and 25% comes from geothermal. Well, you're not going to do that in Western Oklahoma. There ain't none. There's no water out there, and there's no geothermal. So what's out there? Well, natural gas, there's wind, so the electric grid is always a reflection of the society it powers. If it works well, it's a system that has integrity. What kind of geography they have and fuel source will determine the fuel source. So grids are really a almost perfect reflection of the societies that they power.
Yeah. And they have to be, the power plants can't be too far away from the population centers. That's another kind of reality that I think gets lost a little bit because of the whole, just everyone feels not in my backyard about just about anything, but, if there isn't a power plant close to where you are, distance that the power has to travel, you lose wattage. It's very hard to transfer it over great distances. And when, and to take, as you mentioned, Iceland has geothermal and hydro capabilities. We don't have those in Western Oklahoma. To be able to pull geothermal power from wherever you'd have to get to electrify Western Oklahoma, you'd lose so much of the power, and it'd be so expensive that, electric rates would just be manageable for anyone.
Right. Well, and also keep in mind, this is one of the things that I've been looking at a lot is land use conflicts. And I have a whole chapter in the book, in fact, it's the longest chapter in the book. It's called This Land is Our Land, about the resistance to the encroachment of wind energy. Hinton, Oklahoma, and we're talking about Western Oklahoma, was sued by NextEra Energy, the world's biggest renewable energy producer, because Hinton passed an ordinance saying we don't want wind turbines too close to our extraterritorial jurisdiction. Well, they beat NextEra in federal and state court. But that's only one example of this backlash against large-scale renewables. I only bring that up to get back to your point about transmission, which is also difficult to build. And in fact, there was just a ruling today, I think in a federal court in Nebraska, against a high voltage transmission line, 345 kV, that was supposed to go through the Sandhills in Nebraska. And local landowners said, this is the Sandhills. You're not going to run this through our scenic, our scenic, one of the most scenic areas in the whole state. And so, yeah, and I understand it's not in my backyard idea, but people have a right to their property, and people live in their neighborhoods, and they want to protect their property rights. So damn right they're going to fight it. And that's where I see one of the key constraints for the expansion of renewables, much beyond, particularly wind, because the best resources are far from urban centers where the demand is, and you have to build transmission. So this increasing, there's increasing amounts of friction over these, not just the transmission projects, but large scale renewables as well.
That's right. And, I think that you mentioned you talk about this a lot in the book as well, but, so often you see that you get the sense that policymakers believe that the middle of the United States is unpopulated.
Empty.
The land is not
empty quarter, right? Yeah.
Because there isn't a bank on the corner, or 6-story buildings, that there's nothing there, and that the land is being used, whether it's being used for ranching, for farming, for parks, for a multitude of uses, but the land is used, and the land is someone's and belongs to the community or belongs to an individual or whatever it may be. And the animals that are there and the flora and the fauna that are there, wind turbines have a tremendous effect on birds and on insects and on a lot of things that then have an effect on the food supply. And it just goes on and on. It's an interconnected society. And to just throw up 25 wind turbines, I grew up in Iowa. There are a lot of wind turbines when I drive to visit my family up there. So, and certainly in Oklahoma, we know that there are a lot of wind turbines, but they have a real effect on those communities and what's going on. And it's not no one, this has an effect on real people.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better, Pat. And it's been one of the things I've been studying for the last 5 years. And I was glad to be able to write about it in A Question of Power. In fact, you mentioned Iowa, Madison County, Iowa, the bridges of Madison County. Right. They recently passed a moratorium on new wind projects. So this idea that, as you say, it's just empty land out there. No one's out there. We'll just build it. I remember a few years ago, Thomas Friedman, the New York Times said, we'll just build a wind corridor in the middle of the country. We'll build transmission lines to the big cities on the coast, and it'll be all great, 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 great. Wait a minute. That's not the way it's going to work. And in fact, you have this resistance to wind projects all across the country. There were 200 people, wish I'd had this in the book, in Hawaii last October and November, 200 arrested protesting a wind project. Now, we hear all about protests against pipeline projects, Dakota Access and Keystone XL. We're very familiar with that, but it doesn't fit the media narrative. So the New York Times didn't cover this protest in Hawaii. New York Times won't cover the protests against wind energy in New York State. So the bottom line is not to, just attack wind energy, although I'm a longtime critic. But the fact is that we have to be realistic about land use. And I'm glad you brought the wildlife issue up, because the effect that wind energy in particular has on bats, it's deadly. And the mortality rates are enormous. And this idea that we're going to put up not just a few wind turbines, but a recent study out of Cal Berkeley published last week estimated we'd have to double, essentially replicate the entire installed base of electric generation in the United States, which is about 1 terawatt, 1,000 gigawatts. They're saying, we'll put up 600 gigawatts of new wind and 500 gigawatts of new solar. Not one mention in this report of wildlife, not one, of birds and bats, and not a single mention of land use or what the footprint of this would be. But it's from one of the most prestigious universities in America. And it's like, we can do this and it'll be cheap and, it won't cost very much and we'll save, health benefits, this, that, and the other. And I thought, have you ever been outside of Berkeley? Have you ever gone to rural Oklahoma? Have you ever talked to a mayor of a small town fighting one of these projects? It's this myopia and really innumerate. I mean, just completely innumerate. Oh, well, we'll just throw these all up because it's, as you say, it's a bunch of empty land out there. No, it's not.
Right, right. We have a question that's here, and this is a good opportunity to also mention that if you have a question, there's a Q&A function here in Zoom. If you're watching on Facebook right now, put the question in the comments, and I'll be able to check that and ask Robert the question. Question comes from Stephen. Stephen has a very familiar last name, so you may know Stephen a little bit. What are your thoughts of governments or dictatorships that want to keep the masses in their country without electricity? Also, what are the risks of acts of terrorism against the grid or a grid-based ransomware attack?
Well, I think I'll take the last one first. Steve Bryce, I didn't know he's out of jail. It's great. He's been in the hokey, what are the Hooskow? That was it. The pokey. No, I joke. The grid is vulnerable. And one of the things that I wrote about in the book is the attack on the Metcalf substation in California a few years ago, where there was over 100 rounds, AK-47 rounds. Some yahoos went in the middle of the night, disconnected all the alarm systems and shot big holes in these massive transformers at this one substation in Santa Clara County, California. The perpetrators were never caught. And it's puzzled law enforcement ever since. But to me, it just suggested, and I make the point of, well, why couldn't this happen again? Why couldn't they go to some of these really big transformer stations, and then that might have a cascading effect throughout the rest of the grid? So believe me, I mean, the people that want to hurt America understand this very well. So the threats, the possibilities from an electromagnetic pulse, an EMP, the book 1 Second After, William Forsythe's book, talks about this in great detail, his novel. So the grid is vulnerable, absolutely. And if it goes down for more than about 48 hours, well, society starts to break down really quickly. And especially the medical system, as we talked about earlier. Countries that want to keep their people in the dark, well, North Korea, the short, fat dictator over there loves to keep his people in the dark because it's easier to control them. They can't listen to television. They can't listen to the radio. There's some really interesting, amazing photos. Obviously, you can see them, NASA photos at night showing the North and South Korea, and the north and the part of the peninsula is completely dark and the south is lit. I mean, people, but to that point about people will do what they have to do to get the electricity they need. You can also see in North Korea putting up very small solar panels on very tall poles because they just want a little bit of juice, and they'll, charge their cell phone or whatever it is. So, electricity is critical.
Yes. We had a question that came in via email earlier today from Robert, and this is, you have previously proposed an end-to-end natural gas and nuclear strategy to ensure economic and reliable electricity for America's future. To implement this strategy, what are the essential initiatives for the U.S. to enact over the next 5 years?
I think it's clearly to be, the government needs to get further behind nuclear, and this is a problem because I don't think they have to do anything on the natural gas front, right? We've seen the natural gas industry grow and a lot of it go bankrupt because of overinvestment. They succeeded too well, produced too much gas, bad for the industry, great for the consumer. And that's led to benefits as well by displacing coal. The nuclear sector, though, is much more difficult because the U.S. now is pretty well saturated in terms of electricity. And we don't need that much more new generation. But if we want to have smaller footprints, if we want to have reliable electricity, particularly near big urban centers, nuclear is the obvious way to go. And the Obama administration was supportive. The Trump administration has been, somewhat supportive. But the delays on some of these reactors that are being built now and the cost of building new nuclear is a huge impediment to adding a new nuclear capacity. It still costs too much and takes too long to build, and utilities are risk averse, and they're not going to bet their company saying, oh, well, we'll bet $10 billion on a new reactor. We need smaller, safer, passively safe nuclear reactors that are cheaper, that can be deployed at the 20, 50, 100 megawatt scale. And instead, the only choice we have really now is 1,000 megawatt scale.
Right. Yeah. And so, I mean, that becomes, do you see, technology being a solution here? Are there going to be engineers that develop these smaller reactors that can fill this little space, or is it going to take some kind of public demand for this, and that doesn't seem to be there right now. It doesn't seem as though to me that the public is interested in nuclear. But part of that is also, as you mentioned earlier, you get a lot of media coverage over solar, you get a lot of media coverage for hydro, you get a lot of media coverage for wind, that these are the solutions, and nuclear just kind of sits back there and really only pops up
right
every 10 years when there's a disaster someplace or a near disaster.
Right. Nuclear just doesn't have the constituency on Capitol Hill the other industries do. You're from Iowa. The Iowa delegation is pro-wind. They're pro-ethanol. The Texas delegation, some of them are pro-wind, but they're almost all pro-oil and gas. Same with the Oklahoma delegation on Capitol Hill. The nuclear industry doesn't have a geographic center of power. So there's not a delegation from a certain number of states that say we're pro-nuclear. Add in these other factors that you laid out pretty well, and it's difficult for nuclear energy to make inroads. And there's also a partisan divide here. Republicans are overwhelmingly in polls pro-nuclear. Democrats, the last time the Democratic Party in the United States said anything positive about nuclear energy, I've looked, was in 1972. I mean, they're reflexively anti-nuclear, and they have repeatedly in their platforms in 2016, 2012 said, we need 100% renewable energy. Well, 100% renewable energy, really? Even for cars? Even for cars. So it's an extreme position, but that's the position that we're in. And nuclear, I think it's getting many more adherents on the left, and particularly among climate activists. But even if we had this new reactor design, and the AP1000 by Westinghouse is the newest design, even if we had a new design of 20, 25 megawatts, Oklo has a new design, it's about 2 to 5 megawatts. Even if it gets licensed today, to deploy it at the scale we need, at terawatt scale, gigawatt and terawatt scale, it'll take, a decade, 2 decades, and that's a long time.
Well, and I want to talk about the idea of a completely renewable. I know that that's more of a, an American standard, but America kind of remains a global leader in a lot of ways. And the idea that a country like Nigeria, to come back to one of our first talk, or India or China or any of these other, the 3.3 billion people on the planet who are without reliable electricity in a day, the idea that renewable energy can be the solution to get them electrified seems far-fetched and just unrealistic. And so, I mean, I think there will continue to need to be coal-burning plants. There will continue to need to be the need for natural gas plants, because otherwise, how are these countries, communities, countries, half of the world getting electrified?
I couldn't have said it better, Pat. I mean, we're singing from the same hymnal here. I mean, the reality is that this idea, and I quote David J.C. McKay in the book. He's the late David J.C. McKay, an Oxford professor, wrote a great book called Renewable Energy Without the Hot Air a few years ago. But he called this idea of 100% renewables a delusion. And it is an unfortunate one, but a lot of people want to believe it. But they don't pay attention to the math and the physics. And this is what ultimately, it's really what my career has been about in the last 10 to 15 years, is trying to make things simple, right? I always think about my mom, my late mother, Robert Bryce. Well, she's who I write for, right? I want to write an article that she understands the first time, right? So I look for those things like the refrigerator, right? Well, that's a metric she can understand. Well, here's one for you. Okay, to meet 100% electricity, just to move to 100% renewables with wind energy in the United States would require covering a land area twice the size of the state of California with wind turbines. Twice the size of the state of California. This is from a Harvard study a couple of years ago, and from Václav Smil, who's one of the most noted, well-known writers on energy in the modern era. I mean, there's a massive amount of land, and yet still we're continually told, well, this is the way forward. This is what we need to do. And it's a delusion, but it's a popular one, and it persists. And, I guess I should be thankful for it because it gives me a job.
Well, and this mean, this is going beyond just the energy conversation, but I think that as you mentioned, I mean, you visited India, you visited Beirut, you visited all of these places. You showed some pictures earlier of Kentucky in 1916 and India in 2016, and here we are seeing women doing the exact same thing, washing clothes by hand and spending their entire days doing this, and how much time it takes doing that. You know, to most of us, we know it maybe as a song, if we know it at all, about, you know, wash days and that sort of thing. But it doesn't necessarily require people to travel around the world, but to travel to other parts of our country so that we know. As Oklahomans, we need to be traveling to California and see what things are there, but Californians need to come to Oklahoma as well and get a sense of kind of the country as a whole, and not just one little part where we think, you know, that's a state that we fly over, or that's a place that's just red or just blue or just this or just that. That there's real people there that have real needs, but you know, the solutions that you have may seem like a good solution to you that live in a, you know, I've lived in a big city. I lived in a 10-block radius. I never left those 10 blocks for a month.
Right.
You know? But you come out to Western Oklahoma, and my friends that grew up in Western Oklahoma, you know, to go to the grocery store is a 20-minute drive.
Sure.
And so, and how are you going to do that on any kind of regular basis without cars that you know, burn gas and
Sure. Well, and I think this is reflective of too, Pat. I think it's another area that I'm really interested in, is that the divide. We have many divides in America now, and obviously you know, being a native Tulsan, and you know this now, and it's been in the news, of course, and you know, we have a racial divide. Obviously, we have a political divide between the left and the right, and we have a class divide. But we also have an urban-rural divide, and that urban-rural divide is increasingly what I see is a class divide. And so that wealthy urbanites in the coastal cities, and I hesitate to use the elites, right? But these policies about renewable energy policy, they're coming from largely Democratic voters in big cities. And where do they want to put all this infrastructure that they want? Well, it's out there in flyover country. Well, that happens to be the counties that voted for Trump. It happens to be also, and this is another area that I've been working on lately, is these, in fact, I published a piece in Real Clear Energy just a couple of days ago about this, putting some of this big wind energy infrastructure, especially in some of the lowest income counties in America. That's what we saw in Osage County, Oklahoma, with the wind project that was put into Osage County over the objections of the Osage tribe. That's one of the poorest counties in the state of Oklahoma. That's not a coincidence. That was put there on purpose, and that's what's happening in upstate New York as well right now. So, you know, this class divide. You know, I'm concerned about a lot of things in America right now. The political divide, obviously, the racial tension, but what I'm especially focused on in my work lately is the class divide, because this comes down to energy as well, and it's important that we get this policy right so we don't impose regressive taxation.
Yes. Yeah. So we've talked. I mean, I think we've kind of turned down and really had some critical talk. There's another question here, and I think that this is good to kind of bring us back. Eileen wants to know, what findings make you optimistic?
Well, I'm optimistic because I think there's more joy in life being optimistic, right? It's easy to be a pessimist. It's fashionable to be a pessimist and say, oh, things are getting worse, and, you know, we're not, you know, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. No, the world's getting better, a lot better. We're bringing more and more people out of poverty, and we're bringing more and more people out of the dark. Really, since when I started working on this project, the numbers were about 1.2 billion people without power. The latest numbers suggest that number's under 1 billion. Now, they're not using a lot of electricity, but at least they have some. Right. So what makes me optimistic? Innovation, technology, the proliferation of low-cost solar panels. I'm bullish on solar. I have solar panels on the roof of my house here in Austin. Batteries are getting cheaper. Natural gas generation turbines are getting cheaper. We're discovering huge amounts of natural gas all over the world. I'm bullish on natural gas. I'm bullish on nuclear, but I'm bullish on people. You know, we're not just gonna give up. This is one of the great things about science and innovation and free market capitalism. People are gonna try things, and we're gonna make things better. And we're going to stumble along the way, and we're going to have some friction, and it's going to be ugly at times. We know that, But I'm just optimistic. I'm as Molly Ivins said a long time ago, I'm optimistic to the point of idiocy.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think that's the note that to end on. I mean, we can be all working toward a better country and a better world, and as you said, we're going to stumble along the way, but we put our faith in the people that are here and in people to tackle these problems. And I think that's exciting. I mean, I think that you saw it with the people that you met. You saw it in India where you could see that there was a big difference between, those that could spend their time studying versus spend their time washing, and the difference that it made generationally. As you mentioned in the book, that a change that happens in the life of a child is a 2-generation change. It's not a 1-generation change. It changes their life and their child's life. And if it doesn't happen for them, then it sets it back another generation. And so as we have more people looking for that, as you said, there's innovations in solar, there's innovations in natural gas, there's innovations in nuclear, there's people that are working and tackling this problem. And I think that the future, we can all be cautiously optimistic about.
Amen. You said it as well as I could possibly try. So yeah, no.
Right.
Well, great. Well, Pat, it's a thrill to be on. I'm coming back to Tulsa. I'm going to go to Brownies. I'm going to go to Claude's.
That's good.
Gain a few pounds, but I love Tulsa. I wish I was there with you, and I'm going to stop by the store the next time I'm in town.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much for joining us, Robert. We've got a link to buy the book in the notes, both on Facebook and here on Zoom. If you don't click on it before we get closed out, that's fine. You can always go to magiccitybooks.com, click on the virtual event store, and be able to buy Robert's book and any of our past or upcoming virtual author events, and we've got them all there. Also, if you're here in the Tulsa area and getting out of the house, you're welcome to join us down at the store, 10 to 9 most days, certainly starting next week, tomorrow 10 to 4. So thank you again, Robert, for joining us tonight. Thank you to everyone attending and spending a little bit of your Thursday with us.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.